In the shadows of the palace, King John Lackland secretly stole the wives of powerful barons. Like a ruthless predator, these women, though already married, were pulled into his ambitious game of power. In the year 1199, the bells of Westminster tolled, their mournful chimes announcing the crowning of a new king. The air was thick with the weight of an ominous fate, for John, the youngest son of the mighty Henry II and the indomitable Eleanor of Aquitaine, ascended a throne he was never meant to occupy. Born on December 24, 1166, in Oxford, John was the fifth son of the royal family, so far removed from the crown that his father cruelly dubbed him John Lackland, a name that would echo through history with mockery. But fate has a way of twisting the threads of destiny. One by one, John's older brothers William, Henry, and Geoffrey were claimed by untimely deaths, and when Richard the Lionheart, his final rival for the throne, succumbed to an arrow wound during the siege of Château de Chalice in April 1199, an improbable thing occurred. John, the last son no one had ever expected, became King of England. The irony was not lost on the barons and nobles who watched the coronation, for they knew well the man who was never meant to rule now held the most powerful throne in Europe. But this was only the beginning. John's reign would not be remembered for its triumphs, but for its horrors. A king whose lust and cruelty were as boundless as his ambition. A predator who did not hesitate to seize the women he desired, even if they were already promised to others. Scandals followed him like shadows, and soon his reign became infamous not just for the loss of territories, nor the forced signing of the Magna Carta, but for the darkness that seeped into his very soul. For in John Lackland's world, power and depravity went hand in hand. By the time John Lackland ascended the throne, his marriage to Isabella of Gloucester had already been sealed, an alliance forged in the cold fires of politics, not love, a distant cousin. She had given him no heirs, and more importantly, the union had failed to provide the strategic reinforcement John desperately needed. With the looming threat of King Philip II of France casting a long shadow over his kingdom, John found himself vulnerable, exposed. It was clear that his first marriage, meant to solidify his power, had failed. In 1200, barely a year after taking the crown, fate or rather, John's insatiable hunger presented a tempting opportunity. Isabella of Angoulême, a young heiress to the rich and strategically vital county of Angoulême, a region controlling crucial routes between Poitiers and Gascony, and offering the king dominion over Aquitaine, a prize that would strengthen his kingdom immensely. But there was one problem. Isabella was promised to another, Hugh X, Lord of Lusignan, a man of great power and prestige in Poitiers. Their engagement was no fleeting promise, it was sealed with the fervor of an impending wedding. Preparations already underway. For John, this was no obstacle. His eyes burned with cold calculation, and with a heart untouched by decency, he seized what he desired. He had no patience for vows or engagements. In an act of audacity that would define his reign, John nullified his first marriage, declaring it invalid under the pretext of lacking papal permission, something he had conveniently ignored when it suited him. The young, innocent Isabella, barely 12 years old, was swiftly wed to John, a man nearly 3 times her age. Contemporary chroniclers, who had witnessed this union, spoke of her extraordinary beauty, a comparison to Helen of Troy, as if she were a fragile, ethereal thing meant to be admired. But John's feelings, if any, were far more sinister. Some would claim he was smitten, enchanted by her delicate form. Others, more cynical, knew the truth. John craved the wealth and power of Angoulême more than he desired the girl herself. Hugh of Lusignan, the betrayed fiancé, was outraged. His fury ignited a rebellion, one that would rip apart the fragile English presence in France. Territories, once held tightly by John, slipped through his fingers. This was the first of many lands lost, but more chilling still was the beginning of a pattern. John's predatory pursuit of women had only just begun. At his court, whispers grew like shadows, darkening the halls with rumors of a king who respected no vow, no pledge, not even his own marriage. John Lackland, a man whose desires knew no bounds, had gained a reputation for indulging in the forbidden. He frequently seduced the wives and daughters of his barons, using his royal power to coerce reluctant women or, when his charm failed, taking them by brute force. His behavior was monstrous, a tyrant rather than a ruler, as described by Roger of Wendover, a monk and chronicler of the time. His reign was one of horror, where the daughters and wives of his earls and barons were dishonored without care, and the king himself became more a destroyer than a sovereign. Yet, none of these tales shocked the court more than the story of Matilda Debose, a woman whose courage would only become more tragic in the end. William Debose was one of the most powerful barons in England, lord of vast lands stretching across Wales and the Welsh marches. He had been a favorite of King John, receiving great privileges and vast territories from the monarch. Matilda Debose, his wife, was no ordinary woman of the time. She was beautiful, wise, and incredibly strong, a woman whose heart was as fierce as her intellect. Matilda managed her husband's castles and lands with unparalleled skill, often defending them in his absence. In 1198, she displayed remarkable courage, holding Payne's castle against a massive Welsh attack led by Prince Gwenwyn of Powys, successfully resisting the onslaught for 3 weeks until reinforcements arrived. Such strength and determination were rare in the medieval world, where women were often seen as weak and passive. But it was this very strength that brought her to the attention of the king. John, known for his uncontrollable lust, developed an intense and inappropriate interest in Matilda. He attempted to seduce her, but his advances were firmly rejected. For Matilda, who loved her husband with unwavering loyalty, John's proposals were not only unwanted but deeply insulting. She was a woman who valued honor above all else, and the king's disregard for such principles made him a monster in her eyes. As if this cruelty weren't enough, the story took a darker turn in 1208. William Debose, who had once served John faithfully, had become a reluctant witness to an act of depravity that the king desperately wanted to conceal: the murder of his nephew, Arthur of Brittany. Arthur was a legitimate heir to the throne, and his growing influence was a direct threat to John's rule, although the details of Arthur's death remain unclear. Historical accounts suggest that John either killed him himself or ordered his death in 1203. The king's paranoia and cruelty were laid bare, but his actions were far from over. In yet another display of his tyrannical nature, John demanded that Matilda and William's son be sent to court as a hostage, a way of ensuring their loyalty. For Matilda, the request was unbearable. She refused to surrender her son to a man who had murdered his own nephew. She famously declared, "I will not deliver my children to a king who murdered his own nephew." Her words, spoken with the conviction of a mother's love and a woman's honor, sealed her fate. John's response was swift and merciless. He branded William Debose a traitor, confiscated all of his lands and titles, and dispatched troops to capture him and his family. William and Matilda fled to Ireland, but their escape would be short-lived. The king's soldiers eventually cornered them. William was able to flee to France, but Matilda and her eldest son were captured and taken to Cough Castle. What followed was one of the most barbaric episodes in John's reign. By direct order of the king, Matilda and her son were thrown into a dank, dark dungeon, left to die from hunger and neglect. 11 days later, when the guards finally opened the cell, they were met with a scene so horrific that even the coldest hearts could not ignore it. The bodies of mother and son were found entwined, Matilda's head resting on her son's chest, an image of tragic devotion. But the horror did not end there. The son's face bore bite marks, evidence of Matilda's desperate attempt to keep them both alive by any means possible. In her starvation-induced madness, she had resorted to gnawing at his flesh, clinging to the hope that she could somehow save him. This was the kind of cruelty that became the hallmark of John's reign, a reign built on fear, violence, and heartlessness. The death of Matilda Debose shook the English nobility to its core. It was a moment of awakening, a realization that if John could commit such atrocities against one of his most loyal barons and his family, then no one was safe. Her tragic fate became one of the catalysts for the Barons' Rebellion, a movement that would force John to sign the Magna Carta in 1215, a document that would limit the power of the monarchy and establish the principle that no one, not even the king, was above the law. It was a hard-fought victory for the barons, one that was born from the blood and suffering of innocent lives. John's predatory behavior toward women did not end with Matilda. His reign was filled with stories of his numerous mistresses and illegitimate children. Contemporary historians record that he was almost constantly unfaithful to his queen, Isabella of Angoulême, having at least 5 known illegitimate children with various mistresses. But perhaps more disturbing than his infidelities was the way he used women as mere tools in his political games. When John wasn't taking other men's wives for himself, he was forcing his mistresses to marry his barons and knights as a form of reward, or to seal alliances. It was as though women were no more than pawns on a chessboard, moved and discarded at the whim of a king who cared nothing for their dignity. A chronicler of the time reported that John would transfer his concubines like property, offering them in marriage to his mercenaries. In one case, he forced a mistress, known only in historical records, to marry Godfrey de Mandeville, Earl of Essex. Godfrey, in turn, had to pay John an exorbitant sum of 20 marks for the privilege of marrying the king's former lover. It was a blatant demonstration of John's contempt, not only for the dignity of women, but also for the honor of his nobles. His political maneuvers were marked by the exploitation and degradation of everyone around him. Behind these tales of lust and cruelty stood a deeply disturbed man. His behavior was erratic, sadistic, and at times almost incomprehensible. Some modern historians suggest that John suffered from a psychological disorder, perhaps what we would today call a personality disorder. Others point to his childhood as the source of his malice. As the least favored son of King Henry II, John had been neglected and cast aside by his parents. His father was frequently absent, fighting wars, while his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was imprisoned by her husband for most of John's youth. These early traumas, they argue, helped shape the monstrous man who would later rule England with an iron fist. John's reign, marked by impulsive cruelty and self-destructive tendencies, would lead to one of the greatest military failures in English history. His reign ended in chaos, with civil war ravaging his kingdom. In 1216, weakened by illness, John died at Newark Castle, his reign remembered for its violence and failure. His death was met with little sorrow, even from his closest courtiers, as Matthew Paris, a chronicler of the time, wrote, "Hell became uglier when John Lackland arrived there." The legacy of John Lackland is one of scandal, cruelty, and a deep, unfathomable darkness. His actions not only weakened England politically, but also left a stain on the very soul of the monarchy. Ironically, it would be his son, Henry III, who would inherit the throne and begin the arduous task of rebuilding the monarchy, though Henry would be far less cruel and much less capable than his father. John Lackland, the king who stole from men and women alike, was ultimately consumed by his own unchecked ambition and cruelty. His story serves as a grim reminder that those who abuse their power often fall victim to it in the end. If you like this video, please give it a like or share it with others. Your support is a huge motivation to help me grow the channel. Feel free to leave a comment sharing your thoughts on this story. Thank you for your silent support. In 1216, while his kingdom was torn apart by civil war, King John Lackland found himself ravaged by a sickness far more insidious than any army. Stricken with dysentery during a military campaign, his body, once the symbol of royal power, withered. Abandoned by those who once pledged their loyalty, John's strength faded with each passing day. On October 19th of that year, he died at Newark Castle, an inglorious, humiliating end for a king whose life had been mired in scandal and ruin. There was no outpouring of grief for him. In fact, many of his courtiers, once dutiful servants, seemed more relieved than saddened by his passing. Even the chroniclers of the time did not mourn his death, and Matthew Paris, one of the most famous historians of the period, chillingly remarked that hell became uglier when John Lackland arrived there. After his death, John's memory was sealed in darkness, preserved in the pages of history as one of the most despised monarchs England had ever known. His reign had been a tapestry of failures, territories lost, excessive taxes imposed, and an unforgivable rift with the church that led to his excommunication. Yet, it was not just his political incompetence that marred his name. His personal behavior, particularly toward women, cast an even darker shadow over his legacy. John had stolen lands and riches, but it was his insatiable greed for women, treating them as mere property to possess, that truly revealed the depths of his monstrous soul. Ironically, it would be his son, Henry III, who would inherit the throne, tasked with the Herculean effort of restoring what his father had destroyed. While Henry was no great king, he at least avoided the excesses that had ruined John's rule. 800 years later, John Lackland is still remembered as one of the most contemptible monarchs in English history. His legacy is that of a king who lost everything: lands, power, respect, and ultimately, his kingdom. John's story serves as a grim reminder of how absolute power can corrupt absolutely, and how a ruler's private cruelties can reverberate through the public sphere. His life, built on greed and exploitation, was ultimately consumed by the very darkness he spread. His most enduring lesson is not the Magna Carta, a document he was forced to sign, but the sobering truth that no ruler, no matter how powerful, is immune from the consequences of their actions.